All right. Next up, we are going to talk about tourism policies, specifically the ones that were enacted by the former mayor, Ada Colau. To give some background on who Ada Colau is, she was a Spanish politician, or not was, she is a Spanish politician activist. She was the first female mayor of Barcelona, and she served from 2015 to 2023. She was described as one of the most radical mayors in the history of Barcelona. Her policies mostly focused on affordable housing, social justice, environmental, and obviously the issue of tourism and adapting Barcelona to that issue. There were mixed reactions among the residents. She was sort of divided from the research that I've seen. But a lot of her policies that we're going to be talking today are obviously only about tourism. We're not going to get into other things. She was quoted at one point describing Barcelona, saying that she didn't want the city to become just a cheap souvenir shop. And she cited Venice as another city for an example of what she didn't want Barcelona to become, a city where it's filled with only tourists and it's lacking the traditional culture of the country. So continuing on, the first policy I'm going to talk about is the regulation of the short-term rentals in Barcelona. I broke it down into the specific areas to kind of focus the presentation more. So one of the first things that Colau did when she took office in 2015 was she did a freezer of, she froze all the licenses for establishments that were trying to help tourism, specifically the new hospitality licenses, for example, hotels and private apartments, pretty much meaning that a lot of the hotels that were being built at the time or that were planning on being built a few years in the future after she took office, there was a freeze on them. This froze about 1,500 pending requests and put a pause to the hospitality sector for a little bit. For short-term rental crackdowns, there's a really big issue in Barcelona of people living in apartments for only short-term notices. It lacks the year-round residents that keep the city up and running. So she agreed to target these short-term rental sites like Airbnb, VRBO, and attributed them to affordable housing in Barcelona instead. A lot of the short-term rental prices, or a lot of the housing that was short-term in Barcelona, was causing a surge in housing for the residents, and it was making rent, for example, in a lot of these touristy areas a lot less affordable for the residents. So there was rising housing costs and reduced long-term rental availability. So people who were living here year-round, for example, sometimes could only find an apartment that would be available for 3 or 4 months out of the year. Most of the times, even shorter than that, 1 week, a stay, but not anything in the long term. So it led to a lot of the local residents being displaced. Adding on to kind of punishing these short-term rentals, she enacted fines for Airbnbs. The town hall imposed a fine of 30,000 euros for Airbnbs that were advertising but were unlicensed, so that they weren't registered with the city itself. This made Barcelona the first ever city to create a penalization like this platform. It is really popular nowadays. You can look on Facebook groups and find these short-term rentals, Airbnb, VRBO, all of those sort of things. So they sort of cracked down and created a monetary punishment for those listings. In order to enforce the punishment of these listings, the city would hire inspectors to go around and look at these illegal rentals. And there were fees that were associated with this, also known as the 30,000 euros. Between July and August of 2016, remembering that Ada Colau came into her position as the mayor in 2015, within those 2 summer months, there were 615 illegal tourist apartments that were found, and each of them was fined $30,000. So that was a lot of money that was coming in to the city, and it also showed that this wasn't just a threat. This was a real possibility for people who were listing these unlicensed Airbnbs on other sites. And also Airbnb itself would face fines for instances of noncompliance with local regulations. So it was sort of on the app itself and also the people doing the listing. The goal of all of this was to reclaim the housing for the Barcelona residents. Colau wanted to stabilize the rental prices and prevent tourism from hindering the local community's ability to afford to live in affordable housing in central areas of the city. She believed that people didn't need to be pushed out all the way into the barriers just because these tourists wanted to live near or wanted to stay near La Rambla or La Sagrada Familia, Barceloneta, places like that. So continuing on, another thing that Ada Colau did was increase taxes and fees. This isn't increasing taxes and fees for everything. She specifically increased tourist taxes. What she did was added additional fees for overnight stays in Barcelona. So these mostly targeted hotel guests and visitors that were staying in licensed short-term rentals. This is also another reason why they weren't, why they wanted all the Airbnbs and rentals to be licensed, because the unlicensed rooms, hotels, whatever, were not having to pay these fees. So they were making more money. They weren't being fined as much. But yeah, these would target hotels. So people who were coming here for the day from another Spanish town locally nearby wouldn't be targeted. But if you were staying overnight or for a couple of days, these are the people that were targeted. For tax rates, it varied depending on the type of accommodation. It wasn't a flat rate throughout. Guests in the regulated rental tourist apartments can pay $225 per night on some cases, and then $175 to the city. So kind of varying. If you were a guest in a higher or a more fancy 5-star hotel, you could pay $350 compared to the $225 a night, and then $175 to the city. For the revenue allocation, what were all these funds going to? What was the purpose of doing these? The revenue for these taxes was allocated to infrastructure improvements that were impacted by tourism. For example, roads in really busy tourist areas this is where some of the money that goes towards. Housing at some points. I read somewhere that it was talking about public transport. They were also directed to street cleaning, public maintenance the maintenance of public spaces, and the preservation of cultural sites to sort of mitigate the effects of the increased tourism on the city's infrastructure. Referring to resident support, the tourist tax income also funded programs that impacted the local residents by tourism. This is, for example, initiatives on affordable housing and social services in really heavy touristy areas. So in this case, this was an example of the locals not being impacted negatively by tourists. And in some cases, the tourists were helping the locals. By 2024, this year, it was projected that the municipal share of tourist tax would contribute approximately to 100 million euros annually to Barcelona's budget. It was one of those things where nowadays Barcelona is getting so many visitors, about 20,000, or not 20,000, like 10 million per year, I think was the statistic in 2019. It may not sound a lot, the tax being only about €3, but when you add it up over time, it sure stacks and stacks and stacks. The reinvestment aimed to ensure that tourism benefited the community, and it minimized the financial burden on local residents and sort of helped support sustainable tourism in Barcelona. So, in conclusion, going back to our first topic about the Olympics rebranded Barcelona for tourism, but it did backfire with an influx of tourists. For example, La Rambla has lost its local charm and culture and has since become a tourist trap only. This is partially due to what Tanya was talking about earlier, but also the fact that Barcelona exploded in just 30 years or so. A lot of these major cities have been major cities for 150 years. This is a lot of tourists in a very short amount of time for Barcelona. Point two, the tourism industry can help individuals develop empathy, learn about cultural differences, and learn to be flexible and adaptable. Pushing your comfort limits for talking to different cultures from different countries while abroad can transform your experience abroad. This we've learned just living in our local areas, talking to local people. Sometimes when you're visiting Barcelona, it's difficult to get in touch with local culture, which is why it's good to visit areas that aren't touristy and talk to people who were born here. It can be hard, but it also definitely pushes you out of your comfort zone. And then three, even with new policies enacted, tourism is still rapidly changing the city of Barcelona and affecting native and local individuals. While we do have these policies that are enacted to sort of help provide benefits and support aid to the local residents of Barcelona, the amount of visitors that come every single year just isn't aligning with the money that they're getting to help fund or the time. A lot of these policies take time to put into action. For example, housing policies aren't changed in 2 months. It takes time to get new laws and new policies into play or to see the effects of them. So hopefully in the future, we can come up with a better, more impactful policy, but all of the policies that have been enacted thus far have definitely been steps in the right direction. And these are our 3 reflection questions. How does the presence of heavily commercialized tourist hotspots like La Rambla influence both tourists and locals' perceptions of Barcelona's culture and authenticity? The second one being, how does your choice of living environment, whether in a tourist area or a local neighborhood, shape your daily interactions and experiences with the host culture? And then the third one being, how do you think Ada Colau's approach to managing tourism and short-term rentals through license freezes, enforcement measures, increased fines, and tourist taxes balance the needs of local residents with the economic benefits of tourism? So yeah, please think on these questions. And this is our Works Cited. Thank you for listening to our presentation on tourism. Thank you.